Photorealism is a curse. One of my problems with Unreal is that they give out free photorealistic assets. How dare they, right? How dare they? All of your assets have to work together. They all have to be going the same direction and supporting each other. So when you get your free metahuman, you get your photorealistic 3D character, and congratulations, that was free, but you have now signed up to desperately search for realistic 3D animations, facial mocap, lip sync, voice acting, cloth simulation. All of your background elements have to be photorealistic. All of your particle effects have to be photorealistic. Your cameras have to understand things like diopters, and your lighting has to be movie set style lighting. It's a tremendous amount of highly specialized knowledge, and even if you have that knowledge, it's a tremendous amount of work. Indie devs should not be doing that. That's not what indie devs should be chasing. That makes no sense. The whole point of photorealism is to cost money. That is literally why it exists. It is a prestige affectation. Oh look, big budget game number 42 just came out. How do they show that they have more money than their competitors? By being more photorealistic. Just arbitrarily getting closer to whatever passes for photorealistic these days. That's how you show that you had more money. And you sell your game by saying, oh look, we are more photorealistic than our competitors. Here's David Cage's new game. It's awful. It comes from a very icky place in what passes for his heart. Bad characters, bad writing, insulting progression. It's about robots because it can't make it about humans. But it looks good. Yeah, we spent $200 million on making it look good. It's photorealistic, and that's all that matters. Buy it! I don't want to be David Cage. I'm hoping you don't want to be David Cage either. Unreal is trying to make it possible for us to nip at the heels of that. Unreal is trying to tell us that, oh yeah, that prestige stuff is good. And now you can get a little bit closer. We're giving you some of the tools to get a little bit closer. No, I don't want to chase any of that stuff. As an indie dev, I cannot afford to spend money and time chasing photorealism. I can't afford to try and chase prestige. I'm not after prestige, and I'm hoping you aren't either. I'm after trying to make a game I'm proud of. And I don't think trying to be photorealistic is helping that at all. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that you should just always go as cartoony as possible or whatever, but I wanted to talk a little bit about a positive example to show you what sort of considerations you might be thinking of when you're choosing your visual, when you're directing your art. Here's Final Fantasy XIV. This is an interesting case study because when it first came out, it was awful. I played it and then swore off of it forever because it was that bad. And I've never played it again. Even now, I'm not playing it. This is just the character creator. But what happened is it was so bad that the team decided to remake it from the ground up. With an axe hanging over their head and no particular budget to speak of, they struggled to recreate the entirety of the game as something that was actually decent. And they succeeded. That's what I want to see out of indie devs. That's a sort of thing we should be talking about as indie devs. Not, oh, David Cage had millions and millions of dollars and he spent it all. It should be instead something like, well, this is a studio that failed and did so badly that they had to earn their way back into our good graces. What were their concerns when they had nothing and were scared of, suddenly waking up jobless? What were they thinking about? Because it wasn't how photorealistic to be. Some people are going to say, oh, Final Fantasy XIV just inherits from the other Final Fantasies visually. But that's not the case. Final Fantasies have always had a wide array of visuals. You got cartoony ones like Final Fantasy IX, and you got boy bands in a hyper-realistic car. And there's lots of stuff besides that, too. There's not a specific level of realism that comes with a Final Fantasy game. Except for what's forced on you by what you're trying to make. And that's the point of art direction. All of our assets need to work together to say what we need them to say. So let's take a peek. Here are the humans of Final Fantasy XIV. So the are realistic, but they're not photorealistic. That is, they're obviously anime inspired. You don't have super, super high class, realistic cloth sim or lighting or any of that stuff. The materials don't have subsurface scattering, but they are proportioned like humans. They're not cartoonishly proportioned. Why? Because they needed a baseline set of proportions. They understood that they were going to have other species with different proportions. So if they had had their default humans be very chibi, like in Final Fantasy IX, then it would have been hard to contrast them with people like Lalafell and others in the game world that were going to be the short, cute characters. And similarly, they didn't want to exaggerate the humans in the other direction because they have taller characters like the Elezen and the Raoul and all these characters. By choosing to make their characters realistically proportioned, they opened up the space for the characters that aren't realistically proportioned. They chose an aesthetic that helped to build their final vision. Their humans are exactly as realistic as they need to be to sell the fact that they are the humans and that everybody else is somebody else. They couldn't go any more realistic because the Lalafell would look incredibly creepy if they were any more realistic. And they couldn't go any less realistic or the Lalafell would look too much like humans. These are the sorts of considerations that are always in my mind when I'm thinking about an indie game. I'm not thinking, how realistic does it look? I'm thinking, did they actually get what they wanted to say on the plate? Did they actually manage to bring it to the table? Does their art direction help them say the things they want to say? And Final Fantasy XIV is a great example of art direction that speaks exactly as much as it has to in any given direction. The humans are exactly as exactly as realistic as they need to be in order to sell all of the other species. And they wear the exact clothing they need to sell in order to make all of the other species have their own distinct style that makes them feel more different. By creating this diversity in their content, they are creating that diversity in their world. They're creating that space within their world. And this is something that can only be done if you understand the diversity of the content that you need right from the ground up. This was done by a studio that had just failed. They had just completely bombed, and they were desperate to show that they weren't incompetent and they could do it. And they agonized over it, and they came up with a set of visuals that allowed them to show off the differences in their characters while still being very affordable. From my perspective, this is a triumph. Now, I'm not a big fan of the actual character classes, or not character species. I think that a lot of these are pretty bad, especially in terms of dimorphism. But they say exactly what Final Fantasy XIV wants them to say. And that is something that an indie dev needs to learn from. Rather than trying to chase the most hyper-realistic prestige thing you can chase, it makes so much more sense if you think about what you actually want to say. What do you want the player to be impressed by? What do you want the player to be struck by? I hope your answer isn't how many pores your characters have. Now keep in mind there is also a middle ground. You can go hyper-realistic in very constrained spaces. Baldur's Gate 3, hyper-realistic faces, but just the faces. Just from the forehead down to the chin. And the reason for that is because they understood that those faces were the only things that were going to get close-ups. And they weren't going to get performative close-ups. They were going to be used for close-ups where you're just seeing someone talk, or you're seeing your own face while you're choosing a response, or you've got your little character portrait in the bottom part of the screen. So you're going to get lots of flat close-ups of the face. They don't have to be able to act. They don't have to be able to be distorted. They don't have to have good rigging. So they can be hyper-realistic because they only need to be hyper-realistic within that very one constrained kind of shot. Even then, when that starts to wander, the game struggles. The goblins in the game, they get a lot of close-ups, and it doesn't work out because the goblin faces are obviously just distortions of the human faces, and the rigging is wrong, the textures are wrong, even the normals are wrong, and it makes them look plasticky and fake. And when they talk, it looks bad because they were chasing photorealism for their faces, and they couldn't afford to do it 100 more times for random background goblins. So even when you constrain your photorealism, you have to consider how you're going to see little cracks in that constraint and what that might cost you in the long run. Anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about. Not sure how coherent this was, but I would recommend against chasing photorealism.